Today, we're diving into a story of incredible ambition, of heartbreaking tragedy, but also of amazing resilience. This is the story of Apollo 1, the fire that almost completely wiped out America's dream of reaching the moon, but instead became the brutal lesson that made it all possible.
I mean, we've all seen the pictures, right? Neil Armstrong on the moon. It's just this incredible moment of human triumph. But behind that success, there's a darker, much more painful story. A story about three men whose ultimate sacrifice completely changed the future of space exploration.
So, to really get what happened with Apollo 1, you have to feel the pressure of the 1960s. This wasn't just about exploring space. No way. It was about winning the Cold War. There was this intense feeling called go fever, this relentless drive to hit the deadline, sometimes, at the expense of being careful.
Look, the Soviet Union was just winning. They launched Sputnik in '57, then put Yuri Gagarin in orbit in '61. The United States was behind, and everyone knew it. So President Kennedy goes out and makes this incredibly bold promise. We're going to land a man on the moon and bring him home safe before the decade is over. Just like that, the race was on.
And that massive effort was called the Apollo program. The very first mission with a crew, the one that was supposed to test the brand new Apollo spacecraft for the first time, well, that was Apollo 1. It was absolutely crucial. It had to work to pave the way for everything else.
So, who were the guys picked for this historic first flight? Well, they were three of NASA's absolute best, a crew that had the perfect mix of veteran know-how and fresh talent.
You had Gus Grissom, a total space legend, one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts. The guy was tough, a genius with the hardware, and he was not afraid to tell you if something was wrong. Then there was Ed White, the hero who did America's first ever spacewalk. And rounding out the crew was Roger Chaffee, the rookie, a brilliant pilot chosen for his sharp, detail-oriented mind. This was the team supposed to kick off the whole journey.
Okay, now here's the thing. The day of the disaster, it wasn't a launch day. It wasn't even a big dress rehearsal. It was supposed to be a totally routine ground test, just another item on a very, very long checklist.
The date was January 27, 1967. The crew was sealed up inside the command module for what they called a plugs-out test. All that means is they were going to disconnect the capsule from all the outside power and run a simulated countdown on its own batteries just to make sure everything worked like it would in space.
But things were not going well. The test was full of glitches, especially with the communication system. You can just hear the frustration in Gus Grissom's voice when he radioed down, "How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" It was a pretty clear warning sign that maybe that go fever was letting serious problems slip through the cracks.
Now, here's a critical and just tragic design decision. The air inside the capsule, it wasn't normal air. To save weight, the cabin was filled with 100% pure oxygen under high pressure. This created, and I mean this literally, a tinderbox, where things that wouldn't normally burn could just explode in flames.
And at 6:31 p.m., that tinderbox found its match. A single spark, probably from a damaged wire right under Grissom's seat, lit up the flammable materials inside. It was sudden, it was violent, and it was catastrophic.
The first call from the crew was just pure urgency. Fire! We've got a fire in the cockpit! But almost instantly, the situation went from urgent to completely hopeless. That pure oxygen environment fed the flames, turning a tiny spark into an absolute inferno in a split second.
The speed of this is it's hard to wrap your head around. Within 5 seconds, the heat made the pressure inside shoot up so fast that the hull of the capsule actually burst open. And just 17 seconds after that first call, total silence. It was all over.
So in the aftermath, a totally stunned NASA and a grieving country all had the same question. How did this happen? The investigation that came next showed this wasn't some freak accident. No, it was a disaster waiting to happen, born from a whole series of terrible flaws.
The investigation found this fatal chain reaction. First, you had the faulty wiring that created the spark. Second, the pure oxygen atmosphere that acted like gasoline. Third, all the flammable materials inside, like Velcro and nylon nets, that helped the fire spread like crazy. And finally, the hatch design, which sealed their fate.
And this part is just heartbreaking. The hatch on the capsule, it opened inward. So as the fire raged, the pressure inside the cabin became enormous, way higher than the pressure outside. That pressure difference basically welded the door shut. It was physically impossible for the crew inside or the rescue teams outside to open it. They were trapped.
So the Apollo program was grounded. It really seemed like the dream was over. But out of this terrible tragedy came a complete reinvention of not just the spacecraft, but NASA's entire approach to safety.
The investigation led to huge mandatory changes. That pure oxygen on the launch pad replaced with a much safer nitrogen-oxygen mix. All the flammable stuff inside ripped out and replaced with fireproof materials. The wiring was totally redesigned and shielded. And most importantly, that inward opening hatch was replaced with a new one that opened outward and could be thrown open in seconds.
And these weren't just little tweaks. We're talking about a massive redesign. The whole program was put on ice for almost 2 years, 20 months, while engineers worked nonstop to build a safer ship. The race to the moon had to wait. Safety was now number one.
So what did all this sacrifice really mean? Well, the story doesn't end with the fire. It ends with a legacy that made the single greatest achievement in human history possible.
Here is the simple, powerful truth of it all. Without the horrible lessons of Apollo 1, the Apollo 11 moon landing very likely would have never happened. The redesigned, much safer spacecraft that took Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins to the moon was a direct result of the fire that took the lives of Grissom, White, and Chaffee.
And that legacy, it goes way beyond just the Apollo missions. Think about it. Every single spacecraft that's flown since, from the Space Shuttle to the SpaceX Dragon, uses safety designs that were learned from this one disaster. The outward opening hatch, the fireproof materials, that's all standard now, and it protects every astronaut who flies.
In the end, the story of Apollo 1 is a really tough but vital lesson. It shows us that when you're pushing the absolute limits of what's possible, risk is always there. And it reminds us that sometimes our greatest successes are built on the foundations of our most painful failures.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. As we start looking toward Mars and even further out, we have to ask ourselves, what risks are we willing to take now? And what lessons from the past, like this one, do we have to carry with us to make sure that the next giant leap for humanity is as safe as it is bold?